It's that time. Welcome to the Time to Man Up podcast. And here's your host, Shawn Hess. Well, I want to take this opportunity today to welcome you to the first Time to Man Up podcast. We have been preparing for this for months and months and months. But now the time has come. The time has come to man up. A special thanks again to Clay Cross for letting us use his song. Saving the World was one that just resonated with me when I heard that song. And when it came time to begin this podcast, I felt there was no other song that we could have as an intro besides that intro to Saving the World. And so again, thank you for your generosity, Clay, for letting us use that. The plan right now is for every Tuesday, we are going to be having the Time to Man Up podcast. The focus of that is going to be challenging men in their roles as husband, in their role as parent, in their roles in their community, and also in their church. We want to help men. We want to challenge men in their walk, in the way that they live out their lives. Another thing that we're going to have later on as we develop the Time to Man Up podcast is on Thursdays, we are hoping at some point to have an emphasis on marriage and parenting. Marriage is tough. Parenting is tough. We need to be encouraging people in those areas of life to help them find success in it. What's amazing is as I look back at my marriage and my parenting, what I find is that even when I failed, God still was able to do amazing things. Praise God for that. Another thing that we're going to be doing throughout the year in the podcast is we're going to be having interviews with individuals who bring life lessons to the table to be able to share with us what God has done in their life, how he has used them. And so we're going to bring men onto the podcast that can share those life lessons, those experiences to help encourage you along the way. And then when relevant issues come up, we are going to be having Hess on Point. And Hess on Point will be short segments focusing on issues of the day from a godly perspective, from a biblical perspective. And then one area that we had never planned on, but God seems to be opening up the door in that area, is for a segment that we're going to call Table Talk. And that Table Talk is going to be looking at life through people's stories. We have a lot of experiences out there, and the reality is, as we get further and further from those experiences, we begin to lose the connection for people that even served in the military and things like that. And we want to bring them in and be part of Table Talk so that we can learn from their experiences. Now, as we begin Time to Man Up in the podcast, I thought about what would be the best. And so this won't be a traditional podcast setting. It's not going to be what every week is like. But I wanted to begin by just sharing my story because the reality is there are going to be people that watch this, that listen to this, and they're going to say, who in the world is Shawn Hess? Why should I even listen to this podcast? And I'm going to tell you that this story is not a story of sunshine and rainbows, as most people's testimonies, stories, aren't full of sunshine and rainbows. The best thing that I can think of that my story looks like is this. Have you ever had that pane of glass, whether it's a big window in your home or the front door when you have the glass in, and you have that big glass and you clean it and it looks really nice, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, there are smears on it, there are fingerprints on it, and it's a mess and needs to be cleaned again. And as I think about my story, my testimony, what I think about is there are a bunch of smears on the glass. But in the midst of all of those smears, in the midst of all those fingerprints of people that have impacted my life in a positive and in a negative way, there are also these fingerprints that represent God's work in my life. And hopefully, as I share my story, it will resonate with you and how God has worked in your life. Because in the midst of all of those fingerprints, what I know is this, is that God continued his work no matter where I was in life. And God used those things to then get me where we are today as we launch the Time to Man Up podcast. You see, I grew up in a Christian home, right? I was spoiled. I had great Christian parents. My grandfather was a Baptist pastor, and I had everything you could want in growing up. Great parents, great family, and that Christian influence. My parents were active in the church. They were involved in that, and they shared Jesus with me. And that's why 4 days before my 8th birthday, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Savior. And the reality is, you could look at my life and you could say, I've been a Christian pretty much all my life. Now that as I reach that 55 years old, I think, man, I have been a Christian practically all my life. But here's the thing. We went to church and did everything a Christian should do. Went there, Sunday school and everything you could be involved in. The challenge is that my parents believed that every time the church doors were open, you were there. I'm guessing some of you that are listening to this are the same exact way. When the church doors were open, you were there and you weren't going to miss. But I got to the point where I began no longer enjoying church. You see, when I was a kid, it was fun because we went to junior church and Sunday school and we had all the Bible challenges and it was fun. We sang all the songs. I learned all the songs. That was great. But as I got older, it wasn't so great. And I no longer enjoyed it. It was laborious to sit through a church service. I can remember a few times where our church had a slanted floor and it was wooden, and I would sometimes just let something fall out like a piece of candy my parents had given me, and you would hear it roll all the way up to the front, and it would be like, and it just got louder and louder, and everybody knew what had happened. The question was, who did it? And, I would always get this probably devious smile on my face because you could just hear it. And my mom and dad are probably thinking, would that please get to the end so it stops making the noise? I remember one time we were giving our offering and, my mom and dad were trying to teach us to be faithful givers. And so they would give us a quarter or 2 quarters. And without fail, I would stick those things in my eyes. And when the offering plate came down, I would drop them in. Again, I'm sure my mom and dad really loved that. But that was church to me. And then it began to get so boring that I thought, I don't really want this. What I found was this. I'd grown up being taught sound doctrine, given strong beliefs. But the problem was that my beliefs, they weren't mine. My beliefs were my parents'. My beliefs were what my church believed. My beliefs were based on what people who invested in my life believed. And so all of these influences were where I formed my beliefs, but they really weren't mine. And what I learned was this: seldom will a person stand for another person's beliefs. When it comes down to it, if you've got to die for something, if you don't really believe it, you're not going to give your life for it. You're not going to step out for it. So as I got older, I lost interest in the church. It seemed that every Sunday was a routine. We stood, we sat, we stood, we sat, we prayed, and it all was every week the same exact thing. Maybe different songs and a different message, but it was all the same. And so routine is what defined my church experience. As I reached high school, I was living 2 lives. I had the life that was going to church and doing the things that I was raised to do. And even in youth group, we would have the Bible drills, and I would do my best to win those, but it had nothing to do with wanting to learn God's word. It had all to do with my competitive spirit, and I wanted to win. And so there were some guys in my youth group, and we always competed to win. But again, it wasn't a spiritual thing. It was I'm going to win this event. And so life was that I was raised with the influence of God in my life, but I really wasn't living that out, because in one side, I was that Christian guy that everybody looked to and said, oh, isn't he great? He sings in a quartet. He goes to youth group. He's involved in Bible drills. But then there was the life that I wanted to live, and that life was outside the church. And that was with my friends, and that was hanging out, and that was doing things that in the church they would have told me not to do, but out here, my friends were doing it, and I was safe to do it there. But those two worlds stood in opposition. Somehow, whether you call it God's protection in my life, I was able to function in both of those worlds without destroying my life. But my final 2 years of high school began to be a quick downhill. I had been dating the same girl for a number of years, and just life was beginning to fall apart. It was beginning to get messed up. And though my faith never wavered, I was moving further and further away from the church, because as long as those two worlds were in opposition, the truth is that I couldn't continue to do that. And so I found myself on a slippery slope that was headed toward destruction. And then there was this challenge. And maybe you're listening to this and you were in that same spot, but I had no one to talk to about my slide. No one to talk to about my struggles. When I saw a pretty girl and I had inappropriate thoughts, I had no one to talk to and say, what's going on? I just felt I was a messed up dude that just had a bunch of problems. And right, it was like the Elephant Man. It was like I felt everybody viewed me as this troubled person. But what I also knew is a lot of my friends were having those same troubles. But here was the problem. My mom and dad were both youth group leaders. You might go to your youth group leader and talk to him about it, but mine were my parents. And the last people I was going to talk to was my parents about it. My dad was a leader in the church. And so therefore, I was trying to live this life out here in the world with my friends, but protect the church from it, protect my parents from it, because of their roles that they played. Though I loved my parents and though I appreciate them, they came from a generation where there wasn't a lot of communication with the kids. And so there would be funny comments along the way when it came to life situations, but there was never a deep discussion or an ability for me to just say, hey, I'm struggling with this. Why? Because I didn't want to let them down. It wasn't that they weren't willing to listen. It was that I did not want to let them down. And so what I found was myself living in a destructive manner. Then came college. Couldn't wait for college. I know that there are some of you that are listening today that you thought, I can't wait for college because I get out of the home. I get to be on my own. So college time came, and my father required 1 year in a Christian college if they were going to help me get through college financially. And the reality is, in those days, I couldn't do it on my own. I had a paper route. I worked at a grocery store. I wasn't rolling in the dough. So I needed some help in that. And back then, there wasn't a lot of financial aid that you could get. So when they told me I had to go to a Christian school, it was an easy choice. I chose Cedarville College, now Cedarville University. You can see the official mug there, Cedarville University. And we'll talk about this guy later. But I chose Cedarville, and it wasn't because I thought, oh, this wonderful Christian education that I can get. Because remember, I'm on the slippery slope, and the last thing I'm interested in is a Christian school right now. The reason I chose Cedarville is because it was close to my hometown, where my girlfriend lived and where my friends lived. And I knew there could be that escape to get away from that Christian school environment when I needed to get away. In that transition into college, I had played soccer my whole life, and I made the team and was going to be on the Cedarville soccer team. But I struggled. I struggled to adapt I'd come from a secular school, and we'll just say that we played some rough soccer and number of things, fights that went on in our games and that. And when I got to Cedarville, it was a hard transition for me, and I really did not understand that Christian atmosphere, and it was hard, and it became just this constant struggle that pushed me further down the slope. I felt that I didn't fit in. To be honest, from my view, it seemed like everybody was a missionary kid or a preacher's kid, and I was this odd dude out that was the public school kid. Now, I know that there were more people like me, but it felt that way. And what I know is this. I know we look into where kids go to college, where kids go to school, but here's what I can tell you. No matter where you go to school, you will find what you are looking for, no matter where you are. If you go to a Christian school, you can find people that aren't living out their faith, that are doing things outside of what God would approve of. If you go to a secular school, you can find strong Christians who are living out their faith, and you can connect with them. And that's exactly what happened. I went to a Christian school, and I found those people that were discontent with where they were, struggling with life situations like I was, and it just made me feel a little better for the struggles I was having. And what I did is I began to resist God's work in my life. When I would walk around campus, I knew how some people were living because I was out there living that way. And I would hear them talk one way like they were this Christian and talking all great and all spiritual, but I knew the background. And I was like turned off to the hypocrisy of a Christian school. But here's the funny thing. I was ticked off about hypocrisy, but the reality is I was a hypocrite. And I was living two different lives. When I went home to my mom and dad, I was living one way. When I was out with my friends, I was a total another way. And then came an event that really was, if you want to call it, the straw that broke the camel's back. But myself and a couple friends that had come early to school for soccer camp in preparation for the season, we went to a church, and we went in jeans and t-shirt. Now understand this, in those days, and I know I'm dating myself in this, but in those days, people wore three-piece suits. And so we went to the church, and when we walked in with our jeans and t-shirts, it felt like we had just committed the unpardonable sin. People were looking at us. We felt shunned. To be honest, I wanted to leave right then and there, but we stayed till the end of the service. When I walked out that day, I was like, I'm done with church. I'm never coming back to this church. And what I did is we had chapel checks, church checks, and I began to skip everything I could. I would lie on my paper to say where I went to church because I didn't want to get in trouble. I didn't want to go to the dean's office, but I wasn't going to church. And then to add on to that, my girlfriend of many years breaks up with me. And that was devastating. And that just made me angry with God. And then came this day. I remember getting a call and being told that my grandfather was down in the parking lot and wanted to talk with me. My grandfather, the Baptist pastor, I can't remember a thing he said to me because the reality is when I went out there, I had already turned him off. Just another step away from the church and away from God. Once again, my faith was still intact. I believed in God. I trusted God. But I really didn't want any part of him in many aspects of my life. And then I began to act out, and I began to get in fights in college. I was angry at the world. I quit soccer. I pulled away from sports. I didn't want to hassle with transferring, so I stayed at Cedarville. And it was just kind of like, I'm doing it because it's the easiest thing to do. Stay there. And then between my sophomore year and junior year, I got a job that paid really good, but it was not good for me where I was. And that slide continued on. And then it was my junior year, guys. In my junior year, and remember we talk about the fingerprints. Throughout all of those experiences, there were fingerprints. There were fingerprints of people that were pulling me down. There were fingerprints of people that were trying so hard to help me. And then there were fingerprints of God. And one of those fingerprints of God came my junior year during spring break. Living close to Cedarville, where I went to school, I would often just hang around and hang out with guys because I didn't have anything to do going home. And so I'm just like, I'm going to hang out with the fellas. And we were hanging out, and all of a sudden, a friend gives me a call. And he says, "Did you hear the news?" And I said, "No, what's going on?" And he said, "Carrie's been killed in a car accident." Now, Carrie and I had been unit mates. 3 years we were on, 3 years being unit mates. Our rooms were right next to each other for 2 of those years, and we were good friends. All of a sudden, he's on the way home for spring break, and they're in a horrible car accident, and he and another person pass away. And for me, Carrie was going to be getting married that summer after he graduated. He was a senior. And so it was devastating. And all of a sudden, it was like I didn't know what to do. I wanted to be angry at God. And have you ever had those things in life that come and you're crushed by it, but you want to be angry at God about it? And you struggle with that. And so that's where I was. My world was turned upside down. But God had me right where he needed me to be. Men, remember this, that God sometimes needs to get us to that lowest point so that he can begin to build us up. I remember in college there was a person that did pottery, and they came and they were teaching a lesson while they built this beautiful vessel out of clay, and they were building it up and building it up. And then all of a sudden, in the middle of their presentation, they just smashed it down. And I'm like, what in the world? You just spent all of that time building that beautiful vessel, and in a second, you crushed it. And then here's what they did. They began to rebuild it. And they talked about how God sometimes has to crush us to then rebuild us, to make us better, to make us stronger. And that's exactly what happened to me. And perhaps you've gone through those things in life where God has crushed you, or he has broken you down, and you're at this point where you have to decide, am I going to be angry at God? Or am I going to use this as an opportunity to grow? And so God turned me around 180 degrees. I can't help but to laugh anytime I say that, because have you ever heard somebody give a testimony and they're like, God changed me 360 degrees? Well, that means you're faced in the same direction. But God changed me 180 degrees. What he did is he said, return to me, Shawn. And to return means to totally turn your back on where you're going and go back to where you were. And I had to return back to God. What I can tell you is this. I was never again that same person. I had lost soccer. I had lost sports. I played golf and I played soccer, and those were gone. And college wasn't going well for me. My grades those first 2 years were not good. But all of a sudden, I began to work, and I began to see God change my life. And I determined this in my heart. I was not going to waste the death of my friend. I was not going to waste his death. If God was using that to get my attention, then I was going to use it. And so there is a massive God thumbprint in my life. When God changed my life. And what was interesting is the woman that I was dating at that time, who is now my wife, she watched all of this. And she saw that bad summer before my junior year where I struggled. But she also saw that change that took place when one of my best friends was killed in a car accident. And here's what happened. My faith became my faith. My faith was no longer my mom and dad's. My faith was no longer my church's. My faith was no longer those who had invested in me. My faith was my own. And God changed my life. But here's what you need to know. He wasn't even close to being done. I was a business major at Cedarville. I did a summer internship between my junior and senior year. God worked it out, again, thumbprint, to allow me to have a summer internship at NCR's U.S. headquarters. And after that internship, they offered me a position upon graduation. I was excited. I was like ecstatic. I was like, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to work in business. And to be honest, I wanted to make money. And then it happened. Right before graduation, NCR was bought out by AT&T. And when they were bought out, they moved all of their operations down to Atlanta. Before I even had my job, it was gone. And at this time, life, I'm making changes. Things are going good. I mean, I was an RA. I'd gone from one of the biggest troublemakers to now I'm an RA. Now you can see right here, I've got the mascot. I was the mascot at Cedarville. I was the yellow jacket my senior year. It was so funny because I went to all the basketball games. I loved going to the basketball games. And my senior year, all of a sudden, I'm nowhere to be found at the basketball games. And no one caught on to it. I remember there was one time where the team that was supposed to play us, Mount Vernon, was snowed in and they weren't able to get there on time. And so I remember thinking, okay, I've got to step up. I'm the mascot. Let's do something about it. So I went over to the bench players, the players on the bench, and I tried to get one of them to come play with me. And of course, I'm exasperated. I'm taunting. I'm trying to get them to come out. And I remember this. I went to one of the star players first to try to get them. And I remember the coach coming down and saying, try the end of the bench. And I got exactly what he was saying. The last thing I want you doing, mascot, is going and hurting one of my better players. So I went down and I got a player and he came out and he was really gracious and played along with me. And somehow my first shot went in. With that big mascot head on, I couldn't see what I was doing. So then it was his turn with the ball and I faked a charge. He scored and everybody booed him because he knocked me down, even though it was me falling. And so it was 2-2. And I thought, let's put on a show. And anybody that knows me playing basketball knows I cannot make a regular layup. I have to do something crazy like between the legs or something. And it's not to be fancy. It's just because I miss regular layups. So we're playing one-on-one. It's one basket to one basket. I go around. I go between my legs, throw the ball up, and it goes in the basket. The crowd just erupts. I mean, it's going crazy. Nobody knows who I am. It's going crazy. And I remember after I finally revealed myself on senior night, one of my friends said, you know, now I get it. When you did that layup between your legs, I thought it might be you. And I thought that was so funny. So I was the mascot, and I loved it. So many stories about that. Maybe some podcast will talk about the stories of a mascot. But here I am. I'm getting ready to get married. I have no job. And out of the blue, God's thumbprint, right? I mean, to me, it's out of the blue, but it's really God putting his stamp on it, God putting his thumbprint on it. My home church calls me and says, we would like to hire you as our youth pastor. They said somebody had given money enough to finance it for 3 years. They wanted me to be their youth pastor. I was a business major. I was not interested in full-time ministry, so I turned them down. They called again. I turned them down. In between these calls, what's not happening is a job. I am sending resumes, I am pounding the pavement, and I'm trying to find a job, and nothing's happening. On the third call, I accepted. And we moved back to my hometown. I served there as a youth pastor for 3 years. And then as we were serving, God was igniting my heart for ministry. And he was laying it on me. And so 3 years later, we moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania, where I attended Baptist Bible Seminary in Clark Summit, Pennsylvania. We loved it there. Living in Scranton, we just loved it. And being able to invest in that community while we were there. What was interesting is, now remember this, most people in seminary were Bible majors. Not all, but most of them. And I go there with a business degree. I had a Bible minor from Cedarville, but yeah, I didn't pay tons of attention. I was just trying to get by in those classes. So one of our first weeks there, they were like, hey, we want your Sunday school to be in charge of the Sunday evening service, because I guess different classes led the Sunday evening service every so often. And they said, we need somebody to preach. Now, in our Sunday school class, we had seminary students there. We had people that had come through Baptist Bible College with a Bible major. And no one was willing to preach. So I'm like the least educated. I know the least of any of these people because I went to a public school. I didn't go to Christian school. I was a business major. And now I just was like, I'll do it. I'll preach. What was funny about that, and I'll never forget it, is a woman came up to me after I preached. And listen, that auditorium had college professors, seminary professors. Man, it was intimidating, especially for a business major who had really never preached very often. And a woman came up to me after, and she goes, I just want you to know that corn is not a vegetable. It's a starch. And I'm thinking, I just preached my heart out. I was scared to death and I preached my heart out. And you're going to come and tell me that corn is a starch, not a vegetable. And I thought how crazy that was. But God had given me a passion to do that, to preach. And I loved being able to do that. And then an opportunity came. Dr. Mike Stollard, who was a professor there at the time, he started a ministry called Project Scranton. And he had come from Dallas Theological Seminary and come to Baptist Bible Seminary. And one of the things he had done were inner city ministries. And he said, I'm looking for some guys to do this. And I'm like, I'm your man. I want to do that. So myself and a couple other guys, Rich and Ricardo, we started working with that ministry to inner city families, inner city kids. And it was laborious work. It was tough work. I remember one time we were going and there was a pocket of Brazilians, spoke Portuguese. And let me just tell you this, I almost failed out of Spanish when I was in high school. I didn't do well in Spanish. But I remembered some. Somehow I didn't make it almost, but I remembered it. And so we're talking to these people, and of course they speak Portuguese. I'm trying to speak Spanish. And I remember one time this lady looked at me and she goes, you know, it would be easier for me to understand you if you just spoke English. I was like, ow, that's harsh. And so I learned my lesson with that. But amazing opportunities to reach people and to do ministry. And I appreciate my wife. She came alongside and was part of that with me, even though it wasn't her sweet spot for ministry. She was willing to do that with me. And then we decided that we were going to start trying to have kids. I would tease people that it felt like seminary was full of rabbits having babies, right? In seminary, everybody was getting pregnant all the time. It felt like every week somebody different was getting pregnant. And so for my wife and I, we decided, well, you know what? Everybody else is doing it. Let's try that. So we did. And we found out that Jamie was pregnant, and we were excited about that, but we didn't tell anybody. We were like, we're going to wait till after the first 3 months. We're not going to tell anybody. And in that time, Jamie had a miscarriage. And that was hard to deal with because I was trying to figure out what she needed, how to help her. And men, you know that sometimes when our wives go through things, we don't always know what to say or what to do. And sometimes what we say or do just complicates the situation. And so I'm trying to survive and do the right things. And we're just both kind of hurting from that loss. But what made it real hard is that people would come up to us and say, well, when are you guys going to have kids? Now, to be fair to them, they weren't aware of what had happened. No one knew our situation, but every time they said that, it cut deep. So we learned a valuable lesson from ministry there. Once again, God's thumbprint, teaching us the importance of sensitivity in people's lives. And then came time for me to meet with, there was a psychologist. I think that's what he did. But for seminary, they would give you a battery of tests, of personality tests and that. And we'll just say that I was a little rebellious to those tests because some of them were fine. But one of the tests was like, would you rape or murder someone? And I'm like, I wouldn't do either of those. And it was trying to find out what you would choose. And I'm like, I don't get that. So I refused to take the test. I was like, I wouldn't rob. I wouldn't murder. I wouldn't do any of those things. I'm not choosing them. And one of my friend's wife was the secretary there. And I just went to her and I said, listen, I've done these tests. I'm not doing these two. And so I didn't do that. Well, I knew that when I was going to have to meet with this psychologist, this professor, I knew that wasn't going to go well for me because I was unwilling to take those tests. And then you had the situation, we were just coming off a miscarriage. And I told Jamie, I said, Jamie, you stay home, because what we knew is that sometimes this professor wasn't very kind to the women. And I wanted to protect my wife from that. What I will tell you is this, the meeting went horrible. The professor said some very harsh things toward me, and there were things that I wanted to say. Thank you, Jesus. He held my tongue and kept me from saying those things. But basically, he questioned me going into the ministry. And it came down to me saying basically to him, if God is for this, then it doesn't matter what you think. Now, my motivation probably wasn't very good when I said that. But the reality of that is 100% true. If God is in something, right? The Bible says, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God is moving in this direction, and he had been opening doors all over the place for me. But here's what's interesting. With seminary, you had to do a year internship after your years of taking the classes and learning all the Greek and Hebrew and theology. You had to take an internship. So internship time comes and all the churches are there and they're picking their guys that they want. And one of the churches reached out to me. And I met with the associate pastor and he said, we'd really like you to come to our church. Remember how we talk about God's sense of humor, God's thumbprints? The church that asked me to come and be an intern was the same church that I wore jeans and a t-shirt to and said I would never go there again. I mean, blows my mind, right? So I end up going back to Cedarville where I do my internship, and it was awesome. It was an amazing experience. The spirit of that church was different, and that staff invested in me, encouraged me, and challenged me. And it was amazing to see how God had taken me from I'll never go back to that church to this day, I am so grateful for that church and their willingness to invest in me. One thing I want to share is that when I was in seminary, I felt like the dumbest person there. I really did. I felt that everybody knew the Bible more than I did, and likely they did. I felt that everyone was smarter, everyone was more spiritual, they prayed more, they read the Bible more, and I just felt like so insignificant in there. And God had blessed me and allowed me to be the president of the student body my final year at seminary. But there was a day that we were sitting around the tables in the break room. I tease people that the only reason why I got elected to be the president of the student body is because I brought Pop-Tarts to the university or the college, so that when people were there early or had late nights, there were always Pop-Tarts there for them. But one day we were sitting in the break room, and all of these guys are like talking, and it's like, are you guys all really that perfect? And inside my mind, I'm thinking, I don't even belong here compared to all you guys. And I remember this. I remember in the middle of all these guys just talking about spiritual things, I just blurted out, man, I started sharing my baggage with them. I started sharing how messed up I was in my struggles in the area of physical relationships, in the area of drinking, and all of those struggles that I had had. And some of their jaws just dropped. I mean, it was almost like, and leper, what are you doing in this room? But here's what happened. And this is a major reason why God was beginning to create that passion for men. Because what happened is those students that were sitting in the break room began to share real. They began to share real, who they were under the surface. Because we talk about skipping stones, and I have this stone that represents that skipping stone, and so many of us are good at skipping stones across the water in our relationships. We really don't dive deep under the surface, and that's why we have the big boulder, is because that represents we're going to start throwing some boulders in the water. We're going to stir up the water. We're going to start making some ripple effects. But at that table that day, there were a lot of people skipping stones. And all of a sudden, a boulder was thrown in the pond. And I began to see God work to where God used that time for some people to come real with their past, with their struggles. And God began to use me to encourage men in an environment where I thought I was the lowest of the low. God used me, his fingerprint. So another ironic thing is I graduate seminary in 1997. Here's what's interesting. I'm not saying God did this for me, but it is kind of interesting. In that same year that I graduated seminary, NCR returned to Dayton, Ohio. NCR brought operations back to Dayton, Ohio. Now get that. It blew my mind because I thought, okay, I was going to work at NCR. That job was removed. I ended up going into the ministry. I graduate seminary and it comes back. Amazing to think about that. So after I graduate seminary, I go to Indianapolis. And in that time, my wife and I, while we were on our internship, we had twins, premature twins. And I didn't even get to walk for graduation because my son had surgery. And so I went and took my orals. I remember taking my orals, and you always got the theology teacher. And then those who were THM got the theology guys, the professors. Those that were just normal MDiv, we got the other guys, other professors. And I remember that there weren't enough THM people, and so I got one of the THM professors, and I'm like, remember, I think I'm the dumbest guy in the seminary, and I just got one of the hardest guys for your orals exam. And I thought, I am dead. But that night when I found out my son was going to have surgery, I went from hoping that I would just like get a B maybe to like, what's it take to pass? Because I just wanted to get back home. And so I didn't get to walk in graduation, went back for my son's surgery. And once our kids got out of Children's Hospital, after a lengthy stay there, we moved to Indianapolis, where I served for 5 years as a youth pastor. And then after those 5 years of serving as a youth pastor, and what was interesting is, again, thumbprints. In my first year in Indianapolis, we had 3 families with premature children. Again, thumbprint, God used it in my life. I never would have been able to minister to them had I not been through it. I could have ministered to them, but not in the same way. And because we went through it, I was able to do that. And then we served for 6 years as a senior pastor in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And we enjoyed our time up there. We were with a church that we served there, sold our building, and ended up meeting in a hotel, which was awesome to be able to reach people, and really just a cool opportunity. But then we began to pray, God, our kids are getting older. We would love to be able to return back toward home, back toward Ohio, where I'd grown up. And God opened that door. He answered the prayer. We got contacted by a church in Troy, Ohio, and we were so excited. But again, here is that ironic thumbprint moment. God's humor, right? Company goes away, comes back the year I graduate. God's humor. We get a call from the church in Ohio, and they say, right now we have an interim pastor, and they told me his name. It was all I could do not to just laugh out loud, because the name of that interim pastor was the same psychology professor that had a disagreement with me and told me that he didn't see me as a senior pastor, and now I was going to the church where he had been the interim. I thought, the irony of that. And so we moved in there at Troy, Ohio, and served there for 14 years. And what's amazing is those 14 years were filled with amazing opportunities to become stronger in my leadership as a pastor, to become more mature in that area as a pastor, to be able to see God working through my life as a pastor. And I love to preach. I love those opportunities, but it was also filled with 2 of the darkest times in my 32 years of ministry. Times that I didn't know if I was going to survive through it. And ultimately, I pushed through the first situation. And when the second situation came up, I began to get burned out. And the staff situation just was the final blow to what I was dealing with. But what I failed to recognize is this: God's fingerprints are present in the good times. But guys, God's fingerprints are present in the difficult times. Maybe right now you're facing a tough marriage situation, a tough work situation. Maybe you're having problems with your neighbor. Let me tell you this, is that God's fingerprints are evident if you'll just look for him, if you'll just see that God is working. And what happened is God pushed us out from where we were, knowing that we would not leave without that. He pushed us out and he moved us where we needed to be. I never would have left my job had those challenges not pushed me in that direction. But since we have stepped out in the boat, we have seen God work in all of it. I never thought about a podcast, But God used people to say, you need to get this out there. You need to get this to men so that they can hear this and be challenged by this and grow in this. And so that's our desire. I know that this right now is just talking about my story, but it's important for you to understand my story and where I'm coming from, because I believe those lessons that I've learned along the way give me some valuable opportunity to invest in men, to challenge men to become the men God has called them to be. I never would have been able to take Man Up live to the next level if I would have been a senior pastor still. I didn't have the time. And I'm constantly reminded of what God has done. And so God has given me a passion to help men, to encourage men. Being a husband, being a father is not easy. Now, listen, I'm telling you this either. Being a wife, being a mom is not easy. But I'm going to leave that for someone else. What I want to do is help you men be the men that God has called you to be. This passion helps provide direction for my next step. As I leave the ministry, I know what God wants me to do. But man, it's been 10 months since I stepped away from the ministry. It's been 10 months since I preached my last message. But what I know is this: God's fingerprints have been evident the entire way, and I continue to trust God. What are those next steps with Time to Man Up? Well, this is our first podcast, and I can't wait to begin now with every Tuesday. Mark it on your calendar. Every Tuesday, we're going to be coming to you. Next session, next episode, we're going to be just talking about what got men's ministry where it is today through his work in myself and a man named Doug Jackson, who we tease. I was his right-hand man. He was my right-hand man, but we worked together to begin to build and strengthen men's ministry in our church in Ohio. And I'm going to have him come, and we're going to share just those experiences. So hopefully it encourages you. If you're in a church and you're involved in men's ministry, it encourages you how to develop that ministry. So we are going to do that. Right now we are working on, and I'm so excited. And you can see right over here, opposite direction there. Whoop. But we have just come out with a study, a Man Up study. And that's what it's titled, Man Up. And it's Time to Man Up's first study for men. It's a 10-week study on 1 Corinthians 16, 13 to 14. And when we think about this, God calls us to be watchful, to stand firm in the faith, to act like men, to be strong, and let all that we do be done in love. We have a 10-week series on that passage. We're working right now on a video curriculum that will go with that study. And then future studies that we're working on developing that should come out in the next year or so are Man Attributes, where we look at the attributes of man, the attributes that God wants in our lives. And then one of my favorite studies is When Life Throws You a Curve. When life throws you a curve, how do you respond? There are men throughout the Bible that life threw a curve. How did they respond? And let me just tell you this, the last study was a God thing, because the area I moved to has a lot of retired people. And 2 nights before we moved, God woke me up 3 a.m. And I was able to lay out an outline for a study called The Patriarch. And the theme is, when you become that last generation and everyone's looking to you, are you ready? Because the reality is no one's prepared to be that last generation. It just happens. But we have to understand, no one said it would be easy. Another thing we're going to look at doing is, I'm excited to have some opportunities to go speak at different men's groups. And if you are interested in having me come and speak, I would love to hear from you. You can get on our website at timetomanup.com. And there's a place on there that you can request information. But we have a couple series that are available on that website you can check out. But just get on and check out the website. It tells you what's coming, what's available. But I am excited to be able to get into churches and invest in men directly. So you can find the podcast. If you're watching this today, you've already found it, but that podcast will be available on Spotify. On Spotify, it will have video. That's our plan right now, unless something changes. Spotify will have video. The audio will be on iTunes, iHeartRadio, and again, we're working on Google. And then on YouTube, you'll be able to find our YouTube channel. And all I ask is this. I don't get social media stuff. I don't get how you get all this stuff where you can get followers and all that. So I'm going to just say this. Make sure if you find this valuable that you share, that you like, follow, subscribe, anything else that you do to get the word out. I would just love to be able to reach out to as many men. And my social media influence is pretty small. So I need your help in getting the word out. And so let men know about Time to Man Up. Because we want to begin to invest in men's lives, and we want to get real, and we want to challenge them to stop skipping stones across the surface and begin to throw boulders in the water that build deep relationships, that when the battle comes, it's tried and tested and true, and you've got men in your life that can be there to help you, because God does not want you to fight alone. And he gave you men in your life to fight with you, and he placed you in men's lives to fight with them side by side, because the enemy is great. And then the greatest thing that you can do for me, the greatest thing that you can do for Time to Man Up is this: pray. Pray that God would use this ministry. Pray that God would use it to impact men's lives, that he would use it to heal marriages, to heal families, because that is our true desire in this, is to see lives changed. So as I wrap things up today, I want to do this. I want to give a special thanks to my wife. I have been out of work for 8 months, 10 months, putting this in place. It has been a long process. It has been like, sometimes I can't even remember the day of the week, because I feel like I'm doing the same thing all day, because I've been prepping for this and putting hours of time in. And my wife has been amazing. I mean, she goes to work every day, and for all she knows, I just stay home and watch SportsCenter or something. But she goes to work every day, never complaining, working hard so that we can have health insurance. I'm so grateful for her. Now that this has become real, I'm so excited for it, but I could not have done it without my wife. I'm thankful for my kids. One of the great things about leaving the ministry and moving is when we didn't know what to do or where to go, all 3 of our kids graduated college and ended up 14 hours away in the same city, in the same apartment complex. So when we didn't know where to go, I told my wife, I said, family's important. We're going to go live near family. And so they've been a blessing. And I am thankful for the rest of my family, for my mom and dad, for my aunt and uncle, my cousin, my wife's family has been a blessing. I just am thankful for all of those. And then the friends. I mean, there have been people that have helped me through encouraging words, through financial gifts, that have helped make today a possibility. And so I am so thankful for them. And then who I'd like to thank is this. I would like to thank those who made life-changing opportunities in my life. They helped me become who I am today. For some of them, their purpose was to help me. For some of them, sorry, but they were nagging people in the church that everything I did wasn't good enough. And I mean, I'm not perfect like Jesus. Just in case some of you that know me didn't know that, I'm not perfect like Jesus. Jesus was perfect and still had to deal with those people. And so me not being perfect, one of the hardest things about ministry is that people can say whatever they want about you. And you are expected to take it. And that's hard. that you give everything to take the hill, to fight the battle for people. And the very people that you were there when their marriage is falling apart, the very people you were there when they were dealing with crises, health crises and things, those are the same people that quickly throw stones at you when they don't like a decision that you made. But whether you were there with me or whether you tried to tear me down and challenge me or cause problems for me, I want to say thank you, because I do understand this. Joseph's brothers got him where God wanted him to be. The Pharaoh's wife, with her false accusations, got Joseph where he needed to be. The cupbearer, forgetting about him in prison for 2 years, got him where he needed to be. So that on that day, when he stood before the Pharaoh and interpreted his dream, God's plan was being unfolded. His brothers show up. They're looking for food, and it clicks. That's what you've been doing, God. As I do this podcast today, what I recognize is this: everyone, good and bad, God has used them in my life to get me where I am today, and I'm grateful for that. Why? Because they are God's fingerprints in my life. And when I look at that window and I see all the smudges and I see all the junk on it, all the fingerprints, good and bad, there are some fingerprints that stand out, and those are the fingerprints of God. And that's the amazing challenge. And so join us next Tuesday as we have Doug Jackson with us to talk about where it all began. Thanks for including us in your day. And the challenge is this: stop skipping stones and start throwing some boulders, because it's time to man up. Don't forget that. Have a great week.